Guten Morgen alle! Also, wir beginnen jetzt. I'd like to thank Alfredo for the amazing introduction that I had there. Not every day that we get her biography read in an audience, so that's very exciting for me. So we shall begin. Why not? Media and peace, friends or foes? Now, in the beginning, when we look at this, it's kind of interesting because I could go in 30,000 different ways, and you're not exactly sure where I'll go, and that's what makes it so exciting. So let's begin. Let's talk about media in itself. Let's talk about communication. Media refers to the means and the methods of communication. That's exactly what I'm going to be aiming at explaining today. And looking at peace. Peace is the absence of war and violence. It represents serenity. It represents something that's so tranquil and nice, and not where we're using swords and machetes to cut each other's heads off. I'm going to be talking about the news media, primarily because that's what I know about. That's the industry where I've worked. And really whether or not the news media has become a barrier to peace or it's something that can bring about peace. Unfortunately, whenever we talk about peace, we have to tell the tale of war. So often, so many of our, exciting reports that we have in the news media have to do with war, not necessarily peace. That's just the unfortunate way that it works, but it's going to be the underlying structure of my presentation. I hope we can have a little bit of fun along the way and talk a little bit about this. In order to do it, therefore, we have to go to the beginning. Not to that beginning, but just when we start talking about war and media. We start talking about documenting media. One of the first war photographers that we ever had, at least in the modern world, was John McCain. He was covering the British imperialist age, covering the Second Anglo-Sikh War, 1848. We're talking about huge swaths of land on the periphery of India, where you had the British infantrymen who were employees of the East India Company who were just hanging out at their tent, drinking and being jolly. This is one of the first photographs that we had of people in a kind of war zone, and it's evolved to go on from that. Not just the jolliness of hanging out in the barracks with your fellow buddies, but also the terrible parts of war, the death, the destruction. This is in northern Virginia in the United States, and it represents Confederate soldiers killed by the Union Army. Alexander Gardner took this picture. He was one of the most famous photographers of the Civil War, one of the first wars that we actually got to see in pictures, not just print articles that you would see in newspapers. It was actually there in front of us. People were actually able to feel war, to see war. That was a big deal for a lot of people. And it wasn't just about seeing war. It was about seeing those who perpetuated war, those who perpetuated the violence, those who took the idea of peace and ripped it into two. One of the greatest photo series that he did is on the assassins of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was shot in the head while he was at Ford's Theater in 1865, in April. He was shot by John Wilkes Booth, who was himself an unemployed actor, who was very much a romantic, shot him, jumped off the balcony onto the stage, broke his leg. He actually went on a 12-day, adventure to escape the authorities. He eventually was killed in Maryland. But he did have co-conspirators, and he had fellow people who were working to not just kill Abraham Lincoln, but the vice president, the secretary of state, the secretary of the Navy. It was actually an entire coup attempt, and that's not really told in history. Alexander Gardner, one of the first media men on this front, was able to take a series of photographs of the assassins who were involved. This is one of the assassins who was sent to the home of Nathaniel Seward. He was Secretary of State for the United States. The aim was to go and to stab him and try to kill him in his sleep. He did end up stabbing him, but he basically just got too scared. He ended up flooding the scene, and they caught him later, and they hanged him along with all the other co-conspirators, and this was all put on film by Alexander Gardner and spread throughout the land. This is one of the most impressive moments, at least in post-Civil War America, where you have this bonding that has to come together of the Union, of the Confederacy, of these two countries that were once separate, or once together, then separate, and then came back together. It was the media that was able to foster that a bit. Then we go even further. We go to something even better, even juicier. Now we can really talk about the media not just documenting war, but actually taking a part in causing it. It's called yellow journalism. It began with the Spanish-American War in 1898. It was actually instigated by my great-great-great-great-grandfather, William McKinley, who was President of the United States at the time. The USS Maine was a ship that was in the harbor in Havana, Cuba. It had been brought there to have armaments. The United States government had for a long time been intervening in Cuban affairs, trying to just offload armaments, to give some money and arms to the local rebels, and to try to overthrow the Spanish who had been occupying the island for a long time. Now, as soon as you have this explosion of the USS Maine, you have this torpedo or bomb or mine, they're not really sure. But the facts don't matter. The part that makes this story interesting is that in the media, in the New York Journal, it was the newspaper owned by William Randolph Hearst, was this great headline: "Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy." They had no proof for this. There was nothing beyond a few reports that were given. Yet this newspaper article, and going on from this point forward, created the conditions necessary to intervene into Cuba and to start the Spanish-American War. There were tales about the cruel Spanish soldiers raping women and putting children into cages. There was a slogan that was put on all of William Randolph Hearst's newspapers: "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." It became exactly what was needed to intervene to start the war. And there is a very interesting moment that's often retold in history. It was William Randolph Hearst speaking to one of his photographers who was down in Cuba. And the photographer said, "Mr. Hearst, I hate to break it to you, but there is no war down here. There's no conflict. There's nothing going on." And he said, "You furnish the pictures, and I'll furnish the war." It's a very famous scene that actually is very, very well retold in one of the greatest movies of the 20th century, Citizen Kane.
Is that really your idea of how to run a newspaper?
I don't know how to run a newspaper, Mr. Thatcher. I just try everything I can think of.
Charles, you know perfectly well there's not the slightest proof that this armada's off the Jersey
Hello,
coast.
Mr. Bernstein.
Excuse me, Mr.
Can you
Kane.
prove it isn't?
This just
Mr.
came
Bernstein,
in.
I'd like you to meet Mr. Thatcher.
I'll just
How do you do, Mr. Thatcher?
Leland, Mr. Thatcher, my ex-guardian.
From
We have
Cuba.
no secrets from our readers, Mr. Bernstein. Mr. Thatcher is one of our most devoted readers. He knows what's wrong with every copy of the Enquirer since I took over. Read the cable.
Girls delightful in Cuba, stop.
Could send you prose poems about scenery, but don't feel right spending your money. Stop. There is no war in Cuba. Signed, Wheeler. Any answer?
Yes, dear Wheeler, you provide the prose poems. I'll provide the war.
That's fine, Mr. Kane.
Yes, I rather like myself. Send it right away.
I came to see you about
Yes,
this
Mr.
campaign of
Thatcher.
yours. This Enquirer campaign against the Public Transit Company.
Mr. Thatcher, do you know anything we could use against them?
Still the college boy, aren't you?
Oh, no, Mr. Thatcher. I was expelled from college. A lot of colleges, you remember. I remember.
Charles, I think I should remind you of a fact that you seem to have forgotten.
Yes,
That you are
Mr.
yourself one of the largest individual
Mr. Thatcher.
stockholders in the Public Transit Company.
The trouble is you don't realize you're talking to two people. As Charles Foster Kane, who owns 82,364 shares of public transit preferred, you see, I do have a general idea of my holdings. I sympathize with you. Charles Foster Kane is a scoundrel. His paper should be run out of town. A committee should be formed to boycott him. You may, if you can form such a committee, put me down for a contribution of $1,000.
My time's
On the
too
other
tight.
hand,
I'll
I am the
waste it.
publisher of the Enquirer. As such, it's my duty, and I'll let you in on a little secret. It's also my pleasure to see to it that decent, hard-working people in this community aren't robbed blind by a pack of money-mad pirates just because they haven't anybody to look after their interests. I'll let you in on another little secret, Mr. Thatcher. I think I'm the man to do it, you see. I have money and property. If I don't look after the interests of the underprivileged, maybe somebody else will. Maybe somebody without any money or property.
Yes, yes,
And that
yes.
would
Money
be
and
too
property.
bad.
Well, I happened to see your financial statement today, Charles.
Oh, did you?
Now, tell me honestly, my boy, don't you think it's rather unwise to continue this philanthropic enterprise? This Enquirer that's costing you $1 million a year?
You're right, Mr. Thatcher. I did lose $1 million last year. I expect to lose $1 million this year. I expect to lose $1 million next year. You know, Mr. Thatcher, at the rate of $1 million a year, I'll have to close this place in 60 years.
The Nye Committee is probably one of the most understudied events, committee meetings, anything of the last 100 years. It was put together in 1934. The United States had known the tragedies of the First World War only to a limited extent. Those of you in Europe and your ancestors knew it a lot worse than they did in the United States, yet they knew it was not a just war. They did not know that They did not think that the United States intervening was itself a good thing. They thought that there had been influences that had come about to really make this happen. The Nye Committee was chaired by a senator from North Dakota, and their report is scathing if you read it today. It talked about how the munitions industry, the military-industrial complex, was lobbying to get all these kind of arms and shipments and wanted the United States to get involved so they could sell more arms to both sides and going on and on. And this is when military-industrial complex first became coined, first got into the usage, and this committee was actually responsible for the Neutrality Acts, which were later passed in the 1930s. Non-intervention was the key of the day. Non-intervention. How different is the United States of America today? That is the legacy of the Nye Committee. And it really shows how much something small like this, a small committee hearing at the time, was able to influence an entire generation of people to be anti-war, to be against intervention. And it worked until the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Not an American state at the time, but just a military base. But that's another point. I've been writing about the Nye Committee for a few years. It's been one of my most interesting topics that I've tried to delve into. It's something that I think any of you, if you're interested, you can definitely look at and study. Now we really have to get into the nitty and gritty. And I'm sorry that we have to talk about the United States so much. It's just so easy. There's so much evidence. And let's face it, they are one of the biggest propagators of war in the world today. So Operation Mockingbird. Now we're really stepping up our game here. We're talking about the Central Intelligence Agency infiltrating news media organizations all over the country, infiltrating all types of foreign reporting. The CIA operation began in 1954 with the coup that was we could say the soft intervention in Guatemala that took it away from the local powers and finally gave the government over to a regime that was friendly to American interest, specifically those of the big banana producers at the time. This was investigated by the Church Committee in 1975, and it showed the CIA had paid journalists and reporters, not just for print, but also for television, and they had used all different types of sources and bogus sources, really, to further a certain narrative and get the media on board with interventions going on in Guatemala, going on in the Middle East at the time, over and over and over again. So the government was knowingly going to the journalists, those who were to present the news, those who were to give us the truth, and giving them all types of bullshit that were peddled in newspapers, peddled in news reports, and led the groundwork for continuing to intervene after all those years.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. Now, we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
Executive session meaning, no cameras, no public allowed. Wouldn't want the American public to know that the CIA actually is hiring a lot of these anchors and reporters who are giving us the straight news on their evening broadcasts. Another important turning point that I think we have to examine if we want to look at war and peace propagated by media is the Walter Cronkite moment. And this has to do with the Vietnam War, one of the biggest tragedies that we've had in the last decade, but of course that is now being surpassed by the ongoing interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan and the entire Middle East. You had Walter Cronkite, huge anchor on CBS. He had tens of millions of viewers. Remember, there were only 3 or 4 news channels at the time, so he was Mr. News, Mr. Fact, the guy who's bringing you what the world is like, your news today. And one of the greatest moments that we have is when he does a broadcast on the Vietnam War, and he breaks away from his normal anchoring position style and gives his opinion on the war and how it's a tragedy, it's a travesty, and it is a battle that the government can no longer fight. This shows that people in media shaming those in power goes a long way. That's what the media is supposed to do. Not propagate war, not give us the reasons to go to war, which we see so often, especially in modern times. We had a man who was going against the system, against the status quo, and that's something to be celebrated.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. On the off chance the military and political analysts are right, in the next few months we must test the enemy's intentions in case this is indeed his last big gasp before negotiations. But it is increasingly clear to this report that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
So that made waves across the United States at the time and much of the Western world. A big straight newsman telling us that the government had failed. Once again, the government had brought about war, brought about conflict, brought about something that we, as the American public, as people in media, as normal citizens, should not and cannot stand for. He was the greatest representation of the idea that journalists must monitor the centers of power. That is your job. That is what you're supposed to do. As a journalist, you're not there to just tell the black and white story using source A and source B and just give it to the public to consume. You have to frame it correctly in a state of mind and hold those who have power and are able to wage war accountable. One of my favorite journalists who does this is actually a German, Lutz Klevmann. He's one of my favorite authors, journalists that I followed for a long time. He's an investigative news journalist. He's from not far from here, actually. Wrote for the London Telegraph, Tagesspiegel, Die Zeit, Newsweek, many other German publications he worked as a freelancer for. He traveled around the Middle East and Central Asia writing a book just on war, on energy politics, and published this amazing book that I recommend to you all. It's called The New Great Game, Blood and Oil in Central Asia. Now, this presents to me the ideal work for a journalist questioning war, a journalist really looking at the facts and wondering, should we have this type of system? Should we have this type of intervention? Should we really be overthrowing regimes in all of these different countries just to steal their resources? It's a perfect analysis of foreign policy, looking at the repressive regimes, the oil politics, and the presence of that, which has inevitably drawn the West into all of these conflicts. And if you look back at all of his reporting, and I would inquire that many of you should do the same, if you look at his reporting, he's provided this skeptical view for so many German readers, for so many British readers, and it's been very helpful. Of course, he is but one man throughout the entire press corps, but he's someone that I've been following and I think has been doing an amazing job. And I want to play a small clip. He often does a lot of videos. He still does a lot of reporting. I just came out with a book. This video will be half in German, half in English, so I think you'll appreciate it. And he's just talking about the conflict, being in a conflict zone, being a reporter in that. And I just want to play a small clip.
Aber es waren schon Situationen, wo ich oft unvorsichtig war. Und erst Jahre später ist mir aufgegangen, dass ich unfähig war, mir Gefahr vorzustellen. Damn, this is real Africa. Tschüss, Mama. Bis bald. I'm with the press. I'm a reporter. With the Telegraph in London. What are you doing? What are you doing? beginning to have second thoughts about what I thought about this war. It's obviously not allowed to carry. Well, what the hell are you doing? I mean, you're carrying a Kalashnikov. You know, get out of my fucking way!
Whoa, whoa, whoa!
This is liberation. I mean, this is a moment in victory. And it's becoming a more and more epic journey. Shoot up in the air.
So the book is actually now available in English, and I think it would be a great read in German as well, but it talks about his history as a journalist and also the influence of his father, his family, his grandfather, all those who had been involved in war for so long. And being now a member of the press corps, being now a journalist, he's able to question that and face it. Though he's drawn to it, there still is a way to criticize it. And he is one of many journalists who are doing their jobs, who are providing alternative narratives, other those than people who stand at a podium and tell us that we must bomb this country or that country, or say that this certain spot must and requires intervention by a grand military force from above. Another great journalist is a British journalist. His name is Robert Fisk. He is a journalist for The Independent in the United Kingdom, and he is the best Middle East reporter that is living today. He's provided more insight on all of the conflicts of the last 30 years in the Middle East and always gives a bitter, sober perspective that really examines why are governments continuously intervening? Why are they continuously starting wars, continuing wars? And he provides just the perfect narrative for that. And it really has given a good skeptical voice to that in the United Kingdom, which is so often one of the war parties as well, as we know often way too well. So he talks about the framing of the news media, how a lot of the time the news media is controlled by the government, not by some kind of assignments that they're received or they're getting paid exactly, but more that they're slaves to the narrative, that they are so in need of information, of a source, that they're willing to compromise their ethics and their journalism. He says that journalists have ceded their power to these authorities so that they get a little bit of information. And in doing that, the media has become corrupted. In his own view, it's natural for any who has ever seen war and conflict to oppose it. Yet somehow, by the strategic framing of those journalists working in battle zones, we get this cleansed, very clean version of war that involves just some people running away from a bombing. We don't actually see the bodies and the blood. If it pertains to a certain conflict, perhaps we do. But when it comes to the overall narrative of intervention and what the West is actually doing in countries throughout the Middle East, we don't see it. And he's given a lot of very, very amazing speeches on this. He's written very good books. He's another journalist that I employ. You look at a journalist who's actually doing his job.
But by and large, we've presented you, as we always do on television, with war as a bloodless sandpit. War, not as I see it, and you would if you go there, and there must be people here who were probably in Vietnam. I'm not the only person in this room who's seeing war, I'm sure. But, you know, war is primarily not about victory or defeat. It is primarily about death. And it represents, I think, the total failure of the human spirit. But this is largely kept from you. It is an enormous irony that you'll see more of what we see in real war in feature films like Saving Private Ryan than you will on television, which is meant to be showing you the reality of war, which pretends that it is. But the war you see on television is basically a bloodless sandpit. And thus it allows people like President Bush, and indeed my own dear former late Prime Minister, Tony Blair, to use war as a policy option, something we might have to do to bring about what we want, not as something which is in the national interest of our people to carry out for our own protection. We can lie to you about that. You know, I'm amazed, for example, that You know, the New York Times had the whole Judith Miller saga of weapons of mass destruction based upon the language and words and information of Upton Shalaby, of all people. Then after the war, this massive, huge, boring, tedious mea culpa about how we should have asked more questions and we should have done this, etc., which the New York Times published. And then bingo, when I open the New York Times now, it's all about the weapons of mass destruction in Syria and the weapons of mass destruction in Iran, and on we go again. You know, I think one of the great problems, it exists in Europe and exists in Britain, but more so here, is this osmotic, parasitic relationship between journalists and power. You know, you only have to see this if, I'm not recommending you to watch presidential press conferences, but if you turn on CNN, again, I don't recommend that, but if you do, and you know, you see the reporters saying, Mr. President, Mr. President, and then the president says, yes, John, yes, Bob, yes, Mary. See, this is the way the relationship works. And I can understand that, you know, when your country goes to war, to challenge authority looks unpatriotic and thus potentially subversive. You know, and there are all kinds of ghosts from the 40s and 50s which hover around us all. But, you know, I think, well, I'll best describe a conversation I had a couple of years ago with my friend Amira Haas, who's a very fine Israeli journalist working for Haaretz. If you don't read her, you should. And we were in Jerusalem discussing what was the job of a foreign correspondent. And being a Brit, of course, I was going on about how, you know, our job is to be the first witnesses to history, blah, 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 blah. And she said, no, Robert, you're wrong. Our job is to monitor the centers of power, to challenge authority, especially when they go to war, and especially when they use lies to do it. And that is the best description I've heard of what a foreign correspondent's job is, or should be, ever. But we don't generally do that. Over and over again, when I watch the State Department correspondent, the White House correspondent, the Defense Department correspondent, or the lobby correspondents in London, they have become mouthpieces for power. They have, in effect, become the spokesman.
That's a problem that we face not just in the United States, but in so many other countries in Europe as well. The spokespeople and the journalist have such a close and, I guess, mutually beneficial relationship that the public loses out. We don't get truth anymore. We get this very clean narrative that's provided by the government. Journalists have ceded all of their power and authority for coverage, so that we can continue to have these stories that are printed in the top with secrets from the administration. This administration official said this, and this anonymous official said that. Meanwhile, that's used as propaganda, much like Operation Mockingbird, to get into our minds and to get us to say, I guess it's okay that we're invading Iraq. I think it was okay to bomb that wedding. I think it's fine that we unload billions of pounds of bombs onto these innocent civilians.
I was in LA, as I just was actually a couple of days ago, and I opened my morning Los Angeles Times, there it is, and there was a story on the front page. This is about sourcing, right? In a battle of wits, Iraq's insurgency mastermind steps ahead of the United States. This was the time of Zarqawi, before he was killed in the US air raid. The story, written by Josh Mayer and Mark Mazzetti, Dateline Washington, a very good place to write about Baghdad, begins, despite the recent arrest of one of his would-be suicide bombers in Jordan and some top aides in Iraq, insurgency mastermind Abu Musab Zarqawi has eluded capture, US authorities say, because his network has a much better intelligence gathering operation than the Americans. But the key is the sourcing. US authorities say, and I followed the sourcing through this story, US authorities say, US officials said one US Justice Department counterterrorism official said, US authorities say, US officials said, page A10, we continue, it gets better or worse, depending on your point of view. Several US officials said, those officials said, the officials confirmed, American officials complained, they said, officials stressed, US authorities believe, said one senior US intelligence official, US officials said, Jordanian officials said, a slight change there, several US officials said, column 8, officials said, officials say US officials said, one US counter-terrorism official said. I think the Los Angeles Times should be called officials say. But this is not, if this is journalism, I've got to get out of my job.
It's a great point to be made. Journalists must question those in authority. It's the only way that we can eradicate the option of war, that we can eradicate the option of dropping bombs or intervening or sending troops. bursting and bombing continuing to go on. That's not how it should be. Journalists should question that more and more. And I'll play one last clip from Robert Fisk just because I think he's so entertaining, he's so good, and you really have to give it to someone who has actually been there. When the bombs go off, when the bodies are still scattered about the pavement, Robert Fisk is there. He's inquiring about who was there, who saw the bomber, what exactly happened. Why did they do it? Why did they do it? That's a question that's never really asked whenever we look at war reporting, we look at anything having to do with conflict. It's never why. It's always because. It's always they were against us. They were insurgents, so we had to kill them.
I think that there is a moral, ethical duty upon journalists to talk directly to you about the horrors we see and to tell you who the bad guys are and what we saw and tell it how it is. Sometimes my reports from battlefields, I feel like I'm writing a medical report. You know, when I went into the main teaching hospital in Baghdad on the day that the first American tanks crossed the Tigris River, I walked into the emergency room and there was so much blood on the floor it was coming over the top of my shoes. There was a young man, probably a soldier, naked, sitting up, and he was on fire. He was covered in phosphorus. He was burning, crying, "Umma, umma, mummy, mummy, mummy." There was a young man, not a soldier, lying on a trolley on the first floor of the hospital, and his right eye was missing, and someone had stuck a rag in the socket and blood was dribbling down it. One boy, a little boy, came in holding his severed arm and shrieking. When you see these things, how do you communicate it? You're not going to see it on television. They're not going to show you. And I end up writing what, in effect, is a medical report. And the doctors talk to me as they're trying to sew arms on or amputate people's legs. And blood is spraying all over the place. How can you ever support a war after you see that?
How can you ever support a war after you see that? For so many journalists, that's not the case because they sit quietly and comfortably in their hotels. They're not really sitting there while bullets are whizzing past. They're able to sit and have cocktails and stay at the bar and watch on CNN as well. That's why it remains incumbent upon all of those who report to really question those in power, not just politicians, but narratives, entire narratives. This is one of the main mantras that I've done in my own reporting, in my own articles, is that we have to question not just what people say, but what people believe. And the entire narratives that are told to us again and again and again. It's not just in the United States. I've done the same talking about Germany, talking about Dresden. It is something so colossal that because we now have this age where we have to talk about things that are politically correct, we're not allowed to question atrocities no matter where they come from. We're not allowed to actually point our fingers at those who are the aggressors and call them such. And this shows more and more with media manipulation, especially in domestic populations. The politicians, as we know, they have to cater to certain interests. Somebody's paying their bills. I mean, they're not going out and having all these fancy dinners with their own money, with your money, taxpayer money. No, no, no. That's all paid by the war manufacturers, those making arms and weapons and guns and tanks and scopes and everything that you can imagine. And the media, in reflecting that, they want to be on their side. They want to tell the story and get the most accurate information for those on the ground, those the politicians. So if the politicians are favorable to war, then the media's job, for so many, and I believe it is wrong, is to try to create a balance. It's black and white. It's those who are for war and those who are for increased conflict resolution. Instead of war and peace, it becomes, well, it's about an intervention versus a no-fly zone. We're still going to be sending resources and troops and guns and people who are ready to invade a country over to this area, but they'll just hang out a few kilometers away. That's why we get these terms, and it's a very good use of language. It's a slight intervention. It's a no-fly zone. It's a ground surge. Brave men and women doing this limited action. They're just training troops. They're peacekeepers. This rhetorical mindset of journalists as well is what allows us to be caught in this trap, this constant trap of war that goes on and on. And in many cases, the media in itself, in its presentation, is serving to the interest so much it's blatant. It's not even as if they're hiding it anymore. You watch any mainstream report on CNN and they're basically advertising the weapons that they're being used.
U.S. and British intelligence experts are scouring every frame of the gruesome video showing the murder of James Foley for clues about who killed him. President Obama offering condolences and tough words as commander-in-chief.
When people harm Americans anywhere, we do what's necessary to see that justice is done.
But before any next steps, intelligence experts have work to do. First, Washington and London are analyzing the British accent in the voice of the killer.
Well, we're very concerned by the apparent fact that there's the murderer in question is British, and we're urgently investigating agencies on both sides of the Atlantic, and then to see if we can identify the individual in question.
Does the accent indicate where he might have come from? Are there cell phone intercepts matching the voice? Could he once have been held at Guantanamo Bay? Experts are looking at the terrain in the video to see if it matches satellite imagery from Iraq or Syria. Until now, ISIS has not made attacking the West a major priority, but now a direct threat. The killing of James Foley said to be retaliation for U.S. airstrikes. The executioner saying in part,
"Any attempt by you, Obama, to deny the Muslims their rights of living in safety under the Islamic Caliphate will result in the bloodshed of your people."
The intelligence community worried about what will happen next.
It's not clear whether the leadership will now pivot towards attacking the West. There's certainly a lot of concern that they could. They have the capability to.
The administration, for now, not likely to expand military action in Iraq, and airstrikes against ISIS inside Syria are unlikely given Syrian air defenses and the lack of intelligence about where ISIS operates.
Okay, I can't stand it anymore. That's something that, especially this reporter, Barbara Starr, if you're not familiar with her, she literally sits in the Pentagon and is handed what to say by the Pentagon. It's not a joke. This is her job. She sits in the office and just reports what the Pentagon says. The Pentagon is the administrative agency that basically conducts all these wars as part of the Defense Department. And I got really tired of this when I was working as a journalist. I was working in Florida, very small thing, just doing local government reporting, and this was around the time that the United States was talking about sequestration, the idea of cutting the budget and making sure that we were going to have a more balanced budget in the future and have prosperity and get rid of the debt. And one of the greatest things to have come about with that is that the Pentagon, which conducts all these wars and intervenes, was going to get cut, was going to get $250 million cut like that tomorrow. And a journalist like me, of course, I was excited. I can't write that, as my headline, but I thought it was great. Until this guy, John McCain, came to town. He came to Tampa, where I was living, and went to talk to the people about why these cuts are so bad, and they will harm everybody. They will harm veterans, and they will be the worst thing that we can have for the U.S. American government because we need strong arms, we need the money, and we have to continue to fight wars. Also, we have to protect the jobs of all you defense contractors. Clearwater, Florida, Tampa, Florida is one of the biggest concentration of people who work for the military-industrial complex in the entire country. I was graceful enough to live there, and that was quite fun. Certainly because I actually got to talk to McCain, and I got to ask him a question. And that became sort of an ongoing series that I had during my reporting for Watchdog.org, talking about what is the role of the Defense Department. Are we just there to give people jobs? To make sure that you build a bomb and you'll have bread on the table tonight? Is that really what an agency of the government that perpetuates war is supposed to do, to just provide employment for the domestic population? If such, then why isn't everybody at war all of the time? What a great idea. That'd be super. And I got lambasted by so many of the local conservatives and Tea Parties. How dare you question the government? We need to talk about a strong American defense. And I had to take it up to McCain. I wanted to ask him about the military-industrial complex. Simple question. I had read a lot of his statements that he has himself given on the Senate floor. Now, if you don't know John McCain, he ran for president in 2008. He is the face of warmongering. He is warmonger extraordinaire. We've seen that face. He is the one. If you have a war to fight, he's going to be there to make sure it gets done. So he came to Tampa and he gave this arousing speech to the veterans, and I figured, I have a camera, I'm here, I might as well try to talk to the guy.
I thought that was a great
Military-industrial congressional.
Yeah, December 15th, 2009. Why haven't you sort of gone on that theme this year?
Yes. Hearings, I attacked them, I write letters. Good to see David here. And 35 is the outstanding example of things that get out of control. I fight it every day.
Yeah. And do you believe that really with the hands that are basically in the budget now, the sequestration cuts are going to throw a lot of people to be upset that they're going to have their cut taken out? That's what you're warning about.
Well, what I've been warning about is a program like the F-35 that's turned into a $1 trillion weapon system that should never have and it's also, as you say, members of Congress.
Now we start talking about members of Congress, and they're the ones who are being influenced, and I just asked him, I'm like, what about you? I mean, how much money are you getting by these war contracting firms? And he just kind of shrugged it off. He goes, I believe it's important, it's vital, on and on and on. That's a face of a more warmonger. And the media isn't really doing their job. The media is not doing their job when it comes to questioning people like this. Instead, they let them rant and rave on television all day, and we get to hear their statement about why this war is good and why this was bad and we should send more troops and why not, it'd be great. It's unfortunate, therefore, that we've now had a certain other type of media come along, that being WikiLeaks, something to where you're having whistleblowers sending information to people who are sympathetic and putting that out there for everyone to consume. They've been able to send this out to newspapers. We have the raw documents that you can upload on your website or computer or do anything you want. You have the facts, the straight facts. It's sad that it's not coming from our legacy media, our traditional newspapers, papers, Die Zeit, Tagesspiegel, Der Spiegel, New York Times, whatever it may be. We're not having these kind of reports where they're questioning the entire idea of conflict and war. Instead, it has to come from this alternative news source, WikiLeaks, which is basically two guys with laptops sitting there and getting all these information through Tor. So that really leads me to the question, why then is peace so difficult? You have all these actors who are honestly playing their parts in the game. It is but a small affair for many of them. They are but individuals stuck as cogs in the wheel. They report the news. They report what the defense secretary says at the certain briefing, and that is it. No questioning. That's my job. And that's what makes it so difficult for there to be peace, for there to be any kind of idea where we can look at the idea of war and see it as this old concept that does not exist anymore. The main reasons I posit are because of ratings. To begin, bombs, sexy. Bombings, interventions, sexy, love it, sell it. Way better than any kind of peace negotiation in Vienna between the Iranian Foreign Secretary and John Kerry. Who's going to watch that? How is that going to bring your viewers in? How is that going to sell newspapers? You tell me. The more and more people that you have tuning in, more people who are reading, the more that the advertisers can sell. And they love that. They love that. Follow the money. These advertising companies and these arrangements that are done, and I've worked in television news, I know how insidious it is. The fact that the news has had to cater to the wishes and wants of the advertisers. It's sad, and it has continued to perpetuate war and show us that advertisers, those who are counting the ratings, the journalists on the ground, they're all playing their own parts in perpetuating this machine. There's some hope with nonprofit news organizations that I've worked with, but they're often I would say, decried. There are questions of legitimacy and saying, well, you're not a real news source. You're not this newspaper that's been around 100 years. You are biased. You're anti-war. You can't report on this stuff. So a lot of their stuff doesn't get through. Another one is power. The news hawks, the big hawks who are there, presenting on the evening news and talking about invading, these guys sound good. They provide good clips. Did you get a clip? Did you get a sound clip? Did you get a good clip? That's what I would always hear in the newsroom. And if you can get a good warmonger on television, it sells. And it's good. And it's easy to put that on there. We also have the status quo bias. We are now in an age of constant war. At least throughout my lifetime, I don't really remember a time when there ever was peace. I don't know if there ever will be. Certainly not if we continue this incestuous relationship between media. War has become, to Orwell's chagrin, the way of the people now. Those who propose change are way too radical. Therefore, there is hope. Don't be sad. I know you're sulking in your chair, feeling a little bit off, but there is hope for those who would like to bring about peace. Specifically, I'd like to point to coalitions of people working together, those who are reporting on war, actual journalists who question the narrative, traditional or not, whether it be through WikiLeaks or through New York Times, Robert Fisk, Ritz Kleveman, any of those, and those who are actually stopping war to bring about peace. In today's age, that happens to be in the United States someone like Rand Paul and someone like Julian Assange. Julian Assange has stated that the libertarian wing of the Republican Party is the only hope for electoral politics. He talks about because they're the only ones who are talking about war, who are talking about espionage, who are talking about spying by the government more and more. And it's these kind of relationships that make me hopeful for a kind of peaceful future where the news media will not fall in and become servants of power. They will question power, and they will be the ones stopping wars instead of starting them and supporting them. Thank you very much.